Welcome to Domestic Turmoil, Progressivism, and Teddy Roosevelt. This is Melinda Cole Klein. With industrialization complete, the 1910s was a decade of great change for America. It was during this decade that the United States was first considered a world leader. Many of the issues of the 1910s are ones we face today, including the escalation of immigration, both legal and illegal, urban poverty, especially among ethnic Americans who resist our economy and opportunities for higher education, and finally access and availability of working class jobs. Keep in mind, most Americans have only had a high school education. It would be in this decade, following several decades of an arms race between recently united Germany and, with the long-standing military presence, Britain, war would erupt. In America, times were changing with the momentum of newly moneyed middle class who vowed to rid society of its social evils such as poverty, crime, and vice. It would be Theodore Roosevelt who would serve 2 terms in office to support the efforts of reformers as their progressive president. Before and after the American Revolution, Americans worried about how to do good in a sinful world. So too this concept lives on in the American collective mind as they advocate community. From their founding in 1630, the first Puritan governor, John Winthrop, argued the colony was to establish a city on a hill, a model community in which its residents represent ethical living for the rest of the world to imitate. Americans reaffirmed this ideology during the American Revolution and frequently reiterated in speeches by members of the Republican Party. Most recently, Mitt Romney in Ohio, August 24, 2012. By the 1800s, it became a permanent American policy towards the outside world. In an evil world, middle-class American citizens and policymakers, then and now, believe that this nation stands for the common good, and its citizens and residents are willing to fight and die for its precepts of freedom and our way of life that we enjoy to this day. After the American Civil War and World War II, regardless of race, gender, or national origin, a citizen or legal resident of this country, it would be possible to attain a higher standard of living through established and accepted principles and practices of ethical habits and family life. These habits include hard work, to support yourself and family members, live a moderate life, and be moral and just. Most law-abiding Americans live their lives according to these common precepts. Most constitutional governments, like the United States, create broad-based social and political policies for the common good. Across time and cultures from antiquity to the present, we ponder over age-old questions. Middle-class reformers in this time, at the time of industry, there was an emerging germ theory, and they put their particular spin on it. Could poverty be cured like a disease? By the 1890s, this concept was debated in America and also in Europe. Perhaps the problem lay in the early home life. Criminals and the poor were products of their environment and intellectual limits. Heritage, or what we call today genetics, was not an underlying reason why, generation after generation, some people are poor. By collecting statistics, scientists desired to access the features. By the 2008 election year, for the second time in American history, the popularity of progressivism, hallmarking social reforms, spearheaded by Democrats, drove the nation into serious debt. By 2011, the Republican Party, also known as the GOP, and Tea Party members challenged this social agenda, creating much debate. Republicans have articulated intelligent conversations regarding the proper ways in which to shrink the size of the nation's debt and return the power of governing to the states. This has attracted a new generation of voters who want the government to be fiscally responsible and accountable for their actions. The concept of the common good will continue to combat the individual political agendas of the few and efforts to protect equality under the law and the U.S. Constitution for the betterment of all. By the mid-1890s, the country had quickly become embroiled in an event because of a union action that undermined the national economy. The Pullman Strike had begun in May 1894 as a peaceful labor protest against a single Chicago employer, the Pullman Palace Car Company. Although all labor strikes were illegal in the industrial era, this did not silence the thousands of worker protests. Protests viewed as civil unrest had been in the past squashed by police. This event opened the door for labor disputes across the country, leading to a national boycott of more than 20 railroads, while developing into a violent confrontation between the federal government, the railroad companies, and American workers. But in 1893, the stock market crashed, leading to the bankruptcy of 16,000 businesses nationwide, including hundreds of railroads. The Depression of 1894 would be the worst until 1929. A mix of employer misdeeds, government aggression, worker bitterness, and general economic desperation transformed the Pullman Strike into a pivotal event, solidifying debates over the rights of employers and workers in an industrial democracy and over the role of the government in regards to labor disputes. In the town of Pullman, the Depression caused layoffs, wage cuts, and increased resentment over the company's housing policies. Before the Depression, only 40% of workers lived in the town of Pullman, while others chose to live in nearby towns with lower rents, greater independence, and the opportunity to buy their own homes. When the Depression hit, the Pullman Company laid off workers, cut wages by as much as 40%. In addition, they gave hiring preferences to those workers who agreed to live in Pullman town rentals. Rents, by the way, were not reduced in parallel with wage reductions, and shareholders received annual dividends of 8%. Angry, Pullman workers joined the American Railroad Union early in 1894 and voted to strike in May after George Pullman and his managers refused to negotiate with the union over wages or rents. 6 weeks after the Pullman strike began, the company still refused all invitations to arbitrate the strike. By this time, public sympathy, mostly played out in newspapers, lay with the workers who had appeared to be battling a stubborn, unfeeling employer. Chaos resulted on railroad lines lasting from June 26 to July 10th. During those 2 weeks, a bloody end came to the national boycott and the local Pullman Strike. During the first week, close to 100,000 railroad workers refused to run and handle Pullman cars, and the General Managers Association, which represented 24 railroads with terminals in Chicago, refused to run trains without Pullman cars. During the first week of the strike, vital transportation arteries in 27 states were stalled and snarled as workers refused to handle Pullman cars. This meant delays for travelers, businessmen, manufactured goods, fuel, livestock, produce, and most important of all, the U.S. mail. By the summer 1894, the gross national product was down by 10% and unemployment rose to 15% nationwide. While lawyers argued labor unions infringed on employers' property rights, the federal government had not the power at this time to mediate a settlement between management and employees. In a surprise move on July 2nd, a federal judge issued a sweeping injunction forbidding the railroad union from interfering with rail service, from interrupting the mail service, or from inducing railway workers to withhold their labor. In addition, the U.S. Attorney General declared the activities of this union to be illegal. It then dispatched over 16,000 federal troops to enforce the court orders. This was the Pullman Strike. After the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898, killing 268 Americans, this broke the uneasy tension that led to war with Spain. In the American press, headlines proclaimed Spanish treachery and destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. William Randolph Hearst offered a substantial reward, some say $50,000, to uncover those behind the terrorist attack. This drove up the drama and sold newspapers. In the end, it was deemed an accident. Apparently, the vessel had hit a submerged mine. In bringing this event to the attention of Americans, it fueled the fires against Spain as an enemy. In time, this journalist would head a revolution in news reporting and the commercialization of selling the news. This son of a wealthy silver mining conglomerate, William Randolph Hearst studied journalism at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In time, the Cuban Revolution caught the attention of Hearst. He believed this rebel conflict was an opportunity to promote his newspaper. And he was right. Newspaper articles on the Cuban insurgent forces trying to seek liberty sold newspapers. Hearst's style of yellow journalism was underhanded and non-traditional, in which he used the power of his paper to influence American opinion in favor of the war. Hearst published tales of atrocities which the cruel Spanish were inflicting on the helpless Cubans. Hearst knew Americans wanted to hear the dirt about corrupt politicians and the blight of average people seeking justice with their own hands. For centuries, the Spanish Empire was losing its power over its colonial possessions after Napoleon had invaded Spain in 1808. Colonial revolutions began shortly thereafter, and by the late 19th century, Spain had few of its colonial possessions left. The Spanish government did not have the financial resources or the manpower to deal with these revolts, and thus rounded up and detained revolutionaries into concentration camps, particularly in Cuba, to separate the rebels from Cuban society. The war was a total war, with Cuban rebels and Spanish troops burning and destroying infrastructure, crops, tools, livestock, and anything that might aid the enemy. Nevertheless, by 1897, the rebels had mostly defeated the Spanish. They were firmly in control of the countryside, and the Spanish were holed up in urban centers. There were, however, very real pressures pushing towards war with Cuba. Faced with defeat and a lack of money and resources to continue fighting the Spanish occupation, Cuban revolutionaries secured $150 million from a U.S. banker to purchase Cuba's independence. As a result of this war in which America became involved, Cuba would gain its independence as a republic in 1902. The U.S. joined Western Europe as an official imperial power with territorial acquisition, which included Puerto Rico and Guam, and before the war with Hawaii. The Philippines remained a U.S. protectorate until independence was granted by 1946. These areas formerly had belonged to Spain. Without the ability to continue Spanish forces in the Pacific in attempts to hang on to the Philippines and islands in the Caribbean, they engaged in peace talks. War in Cuba against Spain only lasted 10 weeks, and American superiority on the battlefield and in naval combat turned the tides quickly against Spain. In the end, America came out on top. They gained control of Cuba temporarily and new possessions as American territories, including Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. During the Cuban campaign in 1898 against the Spanish in a war, this helped to bolster the reputation of a wealthy cowboy-like socialite. It was his leadership style that threw him into the political limelight, eventually to the office of the presidency. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt did not make the final charge up San Juan Hill. The credit for this glory on the battlefield belongs to other men in his battalion, including an African American company. While men in his command charged the final stronghold of San Juan Hill, Roosevelt and his Rough Riders, these were like-minded gentlemen cavalrymen of the 5th Army Corps, charged the smaller and less fortified Kettle Hill. Final movements were made on foot. In time, Roosevelt claimed all the credit for the victory. Afterward, in describing his self-perceived role to reporters, Roosevelt cast him as the most forthright hero in the campaign, and thus laid the foundation for his legend. In addition, Roosevelt is remembered as the first American to be awarded the Nobel Prize by 1906 for negotiating peace between Russia and Japan after their war. By the 1880s, there was a new breed of self-made American businessmen that became millionaires in their own lifetimes, such as Andrew Carnegie, along with dozens of others. But one man, John Pierpont Morgan, became one of the wealthiest men in America. A banker and financier, Morgan and his counterparts illustrate the times they lived in. After becoming partner, Morgan's banking house became one of the most powerful institutions in the world, today and yesterday. I'd like you to think of the following 3 points. In 1895, Morgan's company lent the U.S. government $62 million. Secondly, By the early 1900s, the company owned steamships and railroads. And third, through a 1901 merger, J.P. Morgan and Company took over the business of Andrew Carnegie, which became U.S. Steel Corporation. Along with the acquisition of this corporation, this event created a monopoly of the U.S. steel industry. While Carnegie also had economic concerns, Morgan gave him an offer he could not refuse: $480 million for a buyout bid. Morgan's reported wealth. In 1912, a government banking subcommittee estimated the partners of J.P. Morgan controlled land and resources worth $22+ billion, comparable to the value of all the property in 22 states west of the Mississippi, and this includes Alaska and Hawaii. In many ways, Morgan was renowned for giving back to communities in which he tried to make a difference. These are notable qualities that middle-class and wealthy people have customarily adopted. These practices are aristocratic values and beliefs. Morgan was an avid book collector, along with works of art. He donated millions to enrich the lives of others, such as the Museum of Natural History, Harvard Medical School, a New York City maternity hospital, and supported New York trade schools. Theodore Roosevelt is best remembered for his personality, lust for life, variety of interests, and his cowboyish demeanor. While Roosevelt would become a widower early in his first marriage, he was a man from a wealthy background and Dutch colonial New York ancestry. William McKinley was president during the first 100 Days War with Spain and would endorse the annexation of Hawaii and supported high import tariffs that brought recovery to the national economy after the Depression and Panic of 1893. Teddy Roosevelt ran as McKinley's vice president in the election of 1900, the president's second term. But in September of 1901, the president was shot. Roosevelt, a Harvard graduate and politically well-connected because of his family heritage, had made a most capable president. However, his political format, indicative of the political drive at the time that was gaining momentum from the 1890s. This would be progressivism. And President Roosevelt would profit politically by endorsing progressive ideals and setting them into motion under his watch. Roosevelt appealed to the middle-class voters with his honest, no-nonsense approach to politics, especially to those who were recently people of means. He promised them political reforms, stood for moral and clean living, including being physically fit, and wanted to protect the environment from industrialists. In addition, Roosevelt wanted to bust monopolies, believing they stunted economic growth. This notion supports the idea that social, political, and economic reforms would allow for advancement of society over generations. This message was especially attractive to America's emerging middle and wealthy class, who as a group did not have the heritage to be considered in society by their old money counterparts. By undermining heritage as a measure of status and respectability, this made room for America's up-and-coming society who desired political control. One way to impress those in society was to aim to reform society of poverty, crime, and vice. Under these ideals, American society would become a better place for all. Newcomers to the ranks of the wealthy were neither welcomed nor had they the heritage or manners as compared with the older, more established families of means and status. Because the new middle class targeted social ills such as reducing drunkenness or violence among the working class and poor, this effort improved their standing among their social and political betters. The challenge to establishment to make things better stated that heritage and family lineage did not matter. In America, where diversity was evident from the colonial period, this tolerance to social climbers fit into the, well, at least in the northern part of America, the culture from the 1880s through the 1920s. Under Progressivism, what mattered was personal and professional merit, moral living, and supporting an active market-based economy. At least that was the idea that was promoted by those who wanted political control and had the money, but did not come from a family that was accustomed to such activities. For those from old money, like Theodore Roosevelt, others wishing to enter the political arena as newcomers voted for this charismatic president who promised them change from the old ways. To spur the national economy and to ensure the quickest sea route for reasons of national security, President Roosevelt saw the need to complete the Panama Canal. This building project had struggled for completion for decades. The project had been plagued with tropical diseases causing the deaths of hundreds of workers. This president would negotiate for the U.S. to take charge of the construction, which was completed eventually by 1914. Headed by a French company, President Roosevelt sought to buy the rights to the company and American rights across the isthmus from the country of Colombia. Colombia balked at the $40 million offered for the rights and the $10 million offered for the 50-mile strip across the isthmus. But the president and the local chief engineer on the project did not give up. They organized a local revolt. In addition, Roosevelt had deployed the battleship Nashville, carrying U.S. Marines. This effort was intended to support a revolution to establish the new government of Panama. The plan worked. The president had finished the building of the canal, world trade prospered, and it made evident to the world of his carry a big stick policy. In this case, the Navy was the big stick. Roosevelt was a man of his time. He believed in an active, not passive, approach to foreign policy. In line with social Darwinism, the fittest will survive, Roosevelt argued it was the duty of more developed, this means civilized and morally responsible nations, to help the underdeveloped, otherwise known as the uncivilized, nations of the world. For the American middle class, newspaper articles heralded the millions who came to work and live in this land of opportunity, often as the source of disease and deadly contagions. Between 1900 and 1910, 9 million immigrants entered the United States, the largest number for any single decade in the nation's history before or after. One individual, Mary Mallon, an Irish immigrant cook who worked for wealthy New York City families, would make national headlines time and time again. History remembers Mary Mallon as the first known healthy carrier of disease identified in America. The story of Mary Mallon is one of an Irish immigrant, the judicial system, an active newspaper readership, and the actions by the joint powers of the new science of bacteriology, the efforts by George Soper and others, and the New York City Health Department. By the turn of the century, Americans had not yet fully grasped the concept of the germ theory. The idea that germs that you cannot see, that live in your body, are the source of diseases seemed unbelievable to many. In addition, these germs that people carried, they unknowingly spread to others, making humans the source of death through bodily contact or just breathing the same air. This idea was frightful. At this time, the miasma theory, this is polluted air, was the older accepted medical explanation for the source of disease that had been around since the time of Aristotle. The arrest and detention of Mary Mallon was set in a time when diseases such as cholera, diphtheria, whooping cough, scarlet fever, measles, smallpox, and typhoid were commonly found in slums and rare in wealthy neighborhoods. And the immigrant neighborhoods of New York City at the turn of the century experienced frequent outbreaks of contagious diseases. Middle-class observers paired disease with the poor and the dirty. Overcrowded and squalid living conditions, poor sanitation, impure water to drink, combined with no antibiotics and poor diets, were contributing factors that accelerated disease in America's slums. Once identified as a healthy carrier by George Soper through lab analysis, Mary was quarantined without due process by the New York City Department of Health. In time, Miss Mallon had her day in court, but the health department did not want to release her. After 2 years, she was released because she had agreed not to work again as a cook and to report in. This all began in 1907. During her trial and subsequent release, New York City health officials identified that apparently by 1910, about 3% of former typhoid victims were carriers. They were not a threat to society as long as they did not prepare uncooked food. Sadly for Mary and the people who died, she defied the authorities and returned to cooking. As shown in this newspaper article, Mary was employed in a maternity hospital where an outbreak of typhoid was ongoing. She was arrested and would remain under quarantine for the rest of her life. Miss Mallon, unlike other carriers, refused to believe she infected people and would not comply with the legal terms of her freedom. It was not until 1948 antibiotics were invented to treat typhoid. Today, the phrase Typhoid Mary is used for a carrier of dangerous disease who is a threat to the public health. While there have been a few history books written on Mary Mallon, I suggest the one published in 1996 by Dr. Judith Leavitt of the University of Wisconsin at Madison. The book is titled Typhoid Mary, Captive to the Public's Health. Roosevelt claimed William Howard Taft to be the man to best replace him in the election of 1908. With such an endorsement, it was no wonder this president followed Roosevelt, who had successfully served 2 terms in office. However, soon after Taft was elected, the true features of this president, who alienated not only politicians, but America's middle class as well, came to light. Taft was a progressive, but not of the same mind as Roosevelt. Taft stressed a republic run by the rule of law, preferring judges rather than hired administrators or elected politicians to pass laws about business practices and fairness. Judges served terms for life, and supposedly they were immune to the political mood of the times. Taft proved to alienate businessmen and politicians alike. Politicians, including Theodore Roosevelt, spent 4 long years waiting for Taft's term in office to be complete. Roosevelt, along with Taft and Woodrow Wilson, would run for the office of president in 1912 election cycle. The very overweight president, some say 332 pounds or more, and he was the heaviest president to date, who is remembered as needing a special bathtub in the White House, a topic often in political cartoons. Long story short, Taft failed as a replacement for President Roosevelt.